nerds, what's up? Today we'll be talking about The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie and my first foray into grimdark. See you after the jump. So I've been pretty nervous to start grimdark because everything I've heard about the subgenre just doesn't really seem to be my personal style. People tend to talk a lot about how grimdark has no hope, no heroes, a lot of graphic violence, a lot of graphic sex, particularly graphic sexual assault. These are all things I tend to avoid, things that don't really interest me. But I knew I had to at least try it, and particularly I wanted to try the First Law series because I've been hearing so much about it. I read Half a King about 5 years ago by Joe Abercrombie, and I wasn't that impressed. I didn't think the story was like that great, but everyone told me that that was the wrong place to start with Abercrombie and that I definitely had to try First Law. So I was like, you know what? It's my perfect place to start for grimdark. I'll just kill two birds with one stone and let's, see how it is. So it's a super pleasant surprise that I actually really loved The Blade Itself. I went into this thinking that I honestly wasn't gonna like it, that I was gonna understand it was for other people and not for me. I was kind of biased that way, just thinking like this won't be what I like. And so I was so surprised by what The Blade Itself ended up being. It wasn't what I expected. And so today I'm gonna talk about all the things I liked about it, some of the things I didn't, but mostly how grimdark, at least as presented in the First Law trilogy so far, was different than what I expected. Attesting to the grimdark side of it, there were definitely some graphic scenes of violence that really grossed me out, but I also recognize that I'm a huge baby about violence. Like, the smallest things kind of gross me out. So like when Glock does cutting off fingers, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna skim this so I don't puke. But overall, like, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. It wasn't like those scenes were in every scene, kind of like I expected. But yeah, there was some gross stuff. But overall, the thing that surprised me most about this book was that it wasn't gratuitous. There were so many opportunities for Abercrombie to do the typical sexual assault thread or plot line, and in fact, I kept expecting it to come up, and he just showed so much restraint. Like, he didn't put that in when it wasn't necessary. Everything grim that happened in the story felt more realistic rather than making grim things happen for grim things to happen. And that was something I was very impressed with. Like, I was reading it being like, yeah, that makes sense. That would happen. It wasn't being hit constantly over the head with like, look how many dark things I can make happen, which I think is something that's impressive and also something that made me respond to the story because I didn't feel like I was being manipulated, if that makes sense. It's like, instead of Abercrombie trying to make this uber dark world that was so gritty and edgy, it was more that he was trying to highlight the crappy stuff that already exists in our world and just kind of magnify it. I don't know if I've articulated that correctly. I like that when I read it, it was realistic grim, not necessarily over the top grim. I hope that makes sense. For example, one of my very favorite scenes in the book is when the Mercers are all dragged into that council to prove that they've been corrupt. And we know behind the scenes that there's been so much torture involved, and you're just watching this scene play out and you're like, this obviously isn't justice. No one's right here. Like, the Mercers aren't right, but the way they torture them isn't right, and the council is so corrupt. And it's just cool to see every side is being corrupt. And it's such a good example of how the reason that this book is grimdark is not because it's over the top, gratuitous bad things. It's because there isn't a single person you can root for that's in the right. Like, everyone's in the wrong, but you kind of root for the people you know. And I think that subtle difference really made this book super readable for me because it was about understanding that nobody's in the right versus over the top, dark things happening. Now, I'm not sure if this same restraint is going to be shown going forward. I'll be interested because actually, a few months back, I did a Reddit post about grimdark that didn't have a over-the-top sexual assault, or because it's just something I don't really like to read about, but I wanted to try grimdark. And there was kind of an argument on the thread about whether this book fit into that. Some people were like, oh, definitely do the First Law. There's nothing in it. And then people were like, you're lying. There is something into it. And when I told my husband how impressed I was by how ungratuitous this was, he started laughing and was like, just wait. And so now I'm like, maybe the next books will be worse. But as it stands in the first book, I stand by that opinion. So we'll see going forward. Now, one thing I've heard a lot about Abercrombie before I started this was just like what a good writer he was. People really emphasize his prose. And I do think he's a very good writer. I think he has very good prose. I wouldn't say it's something like so over the top like we usually think of with Rothfuss or Le Guin or Haro. But I mean, it's very good prose. I just think that's not necessarily the thing that I would remember Abercrombie for necessarily. What What I would remember him for prose-wise is his character voice. He has such an excellent way of giving voice to his characters that are so unique. He has such a good way of making characters' internal dialogue sound unique to them and actually independent. It's so rare for me when I'm reading a fantasy novel to be able to read 3 or 4 words of a chapter and immediately know which character I'm speaking from without seeing their name or any sort of picture indication like a lot of fantasy novels do. I knew because he has made the viewpoints of his characters so unique that you can immediately tell whose head you're in. And in fact, I've already started the first chapter of Before They Were Hanged, or Before We Are Hanged, and immediately, like, I literally read the first sentence and I was like, oh, we haven't read from this perspective before. And when I realized that, I was like, wow, Abercrombie really shines at making the voices different. And I think that's an underrated skill that I never have to be told who's talking necessarily before I understand who it is that's talking. And it's interesting because it's not just about, dialect. Like, some of the easiest ways to do it is have someone have like an idiosyncrasy in the way they talk. But for him, it's also just outlook. He's so good at pinpointing the differences between his characters' outlooks and expressing it through inner thought. And that was the thing I was most impressed by with his prose in this novel. Now, the next thing everyone always obsesses over when it comes to Abercrombie is his characters. He has the most unique characters. He writes characters the best. And maybe part of that is what I just talked about previously with his character voices. Now, I loved Logan. He was a great character. I think he was probably the least unique to me. I've read that kind of character a lot, that trope of used to be a super bad killer and now is trying to be reformed and better. I happen to love that trope, so I really liked Logan, but I wouldn't say it was necessarily so unique. Same with other characters I loved, like Bayaz, Maljan, Yulwi. They were awesome characters. I really loved them. They weren't necessarily the most unique. I felt like I've read those characters before, but they were very well done. Now, the character that really stands out, to nobody's surprise, I know everybody is obsessed with this character, is clearly Sandan Glokta. He is the character I read that was like, this is something I've never read before, and this is something that's very interesting. And I know everyone feels that way about him. It's just such an excellent choice to have the handsome hero, the handsome war hero who everybody loves, after the war, after the reality. Glokta is the kind of character that makes you really think about the other fantasy you read, and you realize how maybe other fantasy glorifies war because we only see heroes as heroic and alive or dead. And in fact, there's this just fantastic line from Glokta at the end when he's talking about how he probably would have a statue in his honor if he had died in the war, but unfortunately he survived. And it's just, the commentary that gives is just so excellent. There's just so much subtext in his character. The idea of how we feel about people who don't look normal or what we expect them to look like. About our fears as a whole of interacting and talking to people who have gone through extreme trauma, and how we just kind of want to push them to the side and we don't want to deal with them because it makes us personally uncomfortable, especially that fear when it intersects with someone who doesn't look the way we're used to seeing someone look. All of that is just really good commentary on how we react to people in real life. Sure, Glokta himself and the Inquisition and all that surrounds him is a little fantastical, is a little exaggerated, but the situations he finds himself in and his storyline is just so accurate to how we treat people and how society treats people. There was just so much going on under the surface there, and that I just completely understand why Glokta is such a standout character to everybody, because he was a standout character to me. Glokta, I also think, is just a perfect example of this grim, dark idiosyncrasy where there are no heroes, there are nobody you can really say is in the right, but there are still people you sympathize with. Like that great scene where someone asked Glokta, well, did you talk while you were being tortured? And he was like, of course I talked. I screamed everything I knew, anything that would make it stop. I told them every secret I could possibly knew just to make it stop. And it's just so realistic. In another fantasy, that would be the coward character, right? Glokta would be the one who betrays our main character by giving up the secrets, by not being brave enough to deal with the torture. But in this book, it's just it's realistic, okay, right? Which one of us in those situations would really just take it like a hero? And that was a cool thing to me. I realized I had just thought Grimdark was something different, and maybe that's just this first novel. Maybe I'm speaking too soon. But I just liked that. I liked the idea that it was just kind of seeing more maybe realistic people. how it's not black and white, and seeing that journey, I understood the appeal. Like, it appealed to me. I enjoyed that. The character I hated the most was clearly Luther. I hate him so much. He was so annoying, but he was the good kind of hate where you hate him because he's well written, and you're not hating him because he's just like a bad character with bad characterization. Like, Luther was written extremely well, extremely consistently. Like, I loved how he was written. I just hated him so much. And I do think it's very funny that he was my most hated character. It reminds me a lot of the whole Voldemort and Umbridge paradox where, like, Voldemort's clearly the worst person. Like, Logan and Glokta are clearly worse people than Luther. Like, they've murdered hundreds, they do all these sketchy things. But Luther is like the Umbridge in our lives. He's the kind of the bad that we have to deal with on a daily basis. Like, the kind of person you just like don't want in your life. And so I thought that was just really well done. I liked how there was just like a lot of different levels of gray in there and good and bad. And so overall, yeah, the characters just really work together as a whole, for sure, together. One thing I'm super excited about, and I hope that happens, is a Glokta and RD kind of friendship pairing, or like partners in crime sort of pairing. I really loved that at the end, that they're kind of like, we're gonna watch out for each other. Now, Glokta got sent away, so I hope that doesn't just die, because I think their dynamic together would be so interesting. Like, they're the kind of personalities that I think would mesh really well together, and I hope we get to see that on screen next book, so that's something I'm really looking forward to, hopefully. The pacing was also very interesting in this book. It reminded me a lot of Eye of the World, which is the first book in Wheel of Time. Normally when you're reading a fantasy, you kind of have this typical, like, a little bit like rising action, mini climax, rising action, big climax, and then the fall. And in this book, it's really just like this slow build to the end, and then it ends on a high. And that's really how I felt about Eye of the World. Like, you're reading this book and you're not sure why it's so interesting. Like, there's no climax that's pulling you forward or some big event. It's just slowly gaining traction, slowly getting more interesting, to the point where you don't know why, but you can't put it down. And then all of a sudden it just gets so exciting at the end and then ends on that high. I don't love that all the time, but it worked really well in this book. I really liked that kind of crescendo build of pacing, so I enjoyed that a lot. And just kind of a warning though, it's not like the typical fantasy pacing in my opinion, but I did enjoy it for this book. It was good. Another thing I really appreciated about this book is I could not predict what was going to happen. And I think part of that did have to do with the grimdark nature of it. For example, Luther has this big contest and it's a big deal. And I honestly found myself saying, like, I have no idea if he's going to win or lose this thing, because either way, it's going to move his character forward in interesting ways. And again, the reason I think grimdark has something to do with that is normally in books, you really want our heroes to succeed. You don't want anything bad to happen to them. But in this book, so much bad has already happened to our main characters, and I already went into it thinking this is going to be a grim book. So in some ways that opened more possibilities for me. Like, well, I won't know what will happen because none of the characters are safe. They've already gone through bad, and they probably will go through bad. So that sort of freedom from a happy or good ending made it more exciting because it was more unpredictable, if that makes sense. So that was another really thing I enjoyed about this book in particular, and I'm going to assume about grimdark, but I guess I can't really say since this is my first one. So let's talk a little bit about what I didn't like about the book. I mean, I really enjoyed this book, so the things I didn't like about it are extremely petty. I just get that way sometimes, and I have little petty things I get annoyed by, so we're just going to talk about them. The first thing was actually in the very first chapter of the book, which is when Logan falls down from this like 1,000-foot tall cliff, but it's okay because he falls into water and he just gets bruises. Did none of you guys grow up watching Mythbusters like I did? There's a whole episode about this.
Next up, is the physics of a fall onto water really the same as pavement?
Drop number 2 onto water at terminal velocity.
Stabilizing chute deployed. Looking good.
Belly flop, and...
So, how did it compare to the water drop?
The water drop pig did much better, although it's still 7 fractures compared to 17. 6 rib fractures, and also a neck fracture, but not as bad as the decapitation.
I've grown up knowing this thing about pavement versus water. Water hurts. They have surface tension. Water isn't some like cushy thing you fall into. I know this shouldn't bother me this much, but it does. So okay, it was better that he fell into the water than on the pavement, but the fact that he only came out with bruises is so ridiculous. Now, I am gonna say this one thing. I realize Bayaz is collecting special people. So maybe Logan is special in some way, and he has like extra tough resistance or something, or a special body or whatever. I know this is a magical world. So I will put that caveat in here that maybe I'm gonna find that out. But if not, that scene was stupid, and I stand by that. I was a little bummed at the end with the scene with Logan when you feel like he's gonna die because he has no more energy left, and then some sort of like spirit, I assume, enters him that gives him all this like energy. I'm hoping that's not what I think it is, because I've already just, I've read the whole thing about this super evil character who wasn't actually evil because he was just like possessed by something, and now that's why he's trying to be better, but he has to fight this off. Like, I just read that a lot, so I hope that's not what it is. I'd personally find it much more compelling if Logan decided to change on his own, because I think not having the excuse of a spirit or something inhabiting you, making you that violent, makes the work for redemption so much more difficult and more interesting to read about. So I will be interested where that goes going forward. I can't necessarily make a super judgment on it now, but I'm just wary about it, and I'm hoping it doesn't turn out just to be what I said, because that just, I don't know, it would just cheapen the story a little bit for me. So I'm crossing my fingers for that one too. And finally, just some of the fight scenes got really long for me, particularly at the end where they just went on and on and on. I'm just one of those people who just doesn't love extended fight scenes. They're usually the least interesting part of a book to me, and I know that's really 50-50. I feel like some people love fight scenes, some people don't. So that was more of a personal thing. It got a little long, and I know that will probably be my biggest complaint going forward with this book. It seems like a book that's gonna have a lot of just extended battle, war, fight scenes, and those will get a little slow for me, but it's a pretty small complaint. A lot of books kind of suffer from that for me, just because that's not something I super enjoy when it's long. Overall, this was a super surprising start to my grimdark journey. I really, really enjoyed it. I already bought the next one. It's really nice to feel excited about a series again. I haven't felt super interested in continuing almost any trilogy or series I've started recently. I've read the first book and been like, maybe, maybe not. So it felt good to be like, oh, I'm immediately gonna go and buy the next one. I want to read it, and I want to see what happens. So I really enjoyed it. If you guys want to hear more about how I feel about this, let me know in the comments. I will probably review it again after I finish the trilogy, so not book by book. So if that would interest you, let me know, and I can kind of tell you how I feel about the whole thing together, and maybe there'll be a lot to talk about in the next 2 books. I don't know, but I'm excited to find out. And maybe try more grimdark. I don't know. You guys can suggest below maybe some grimdark you think I'd like, since I enjoyed this one. Maybe warn me if something bad is coming up in the next few books, since I'm a little wary about it. Anyway, and as always, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.